So greetings. I am Kristin Henning, a professor of law and the director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law. I am very happy to be here with you, moderating our discussion this morning about COVID-19 behind bars. During this hour, we will talk about why the pandemic has had such an incredibly detrimental impact within our nation's jails and prisons. And we'll talk about how those facilities have been altered by the pandemic, often in ways that are particularly harmful for inmates. We will spend some time talking about how state and local leaders have been responding to the outbreak of COVID in facilities, including efforts to release inmates and to improve conditions. And we will also talk about the resistance, recognizing that there are indeed some who vehemently oppose early release for inmates. And then finally, we will look forward to think about what criminal justice might look like in a post-COVID world. And we are so happy to have so many of you with us here today. And I hope that you will engage us throughout this conversation. We will be taking questions on the webinar through the Q&A tool on the Zoom feature. And if you are watching by one of Georgetown Law's social media channels, please leave your questions in the comment section, and those questions will be fed to us for us to answer as we go. So we have so much to talk about, and we should dive right in. We know that the pandemic has affected every aspect of American society: our economy, our healthcare system, our schools, our transportation systems, but it has also significantly impacted the nation's prison systems and the ways in which we think about criminal justice in America. As of May 20, more than 29,000 cases of coronavirus have been reported among prisoners, with about 4,700 of those cases being reported among federal prisoners. We have also seen that between 415 and about 450 prisoners have died from COVID-related causes overall. And those numbers are certainly likely to increase as testing is more widespread and more jurisdictions are forced to report. I should note, however, that this number does not include the many prison and jail staff who have been infected by COVID. And unfortunately, we don't have an accurate data count on staff infections, as only about 16 states have released their numbers as of last week. And that brings our total known cases of coronavirus among staff to about 74,000 cases and about 33 deaths. This number, the prison count number, also does not include the number of youth, the number of children who have been infected with COVID-19 in juvenile detention and long-term juvenile justice facilities. On May 26, the Sentencing Project reported about 488 youth and about 580 youth staff who have been infected. And so one final data point that I think we have to highlight before we start this conversation is the data showing that Black and Brown Americans have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 and its related deaths overall. And then when we intersect that data with racial disparities in America's jails and prisons, the impact on communities of colors is particularly disturbing and must provide a lens for everything that we are talking about today. So I am very happy to be here and to be a part of this conversation with a group of amazing colleagues who have been thinking long and hard about these issues. All of our panelists work at Georgetown University and have spent their careers working on behalf of prisoners. As I indicated, I am the director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative here at Georgetown Law School. And along with my law students, I represent young people who have been arrested and charged with delinquency in the District of Columbia. In my scholarship, I write about race, adolescence, and policing, and I train lawyers, judges, and other juvenile court actors about implicit and explicit racial bias in the juvenile and criminal justice systems, and all with an eye towards bringing about meaningful reform in the system. But I am joined by a wonderful group, Marc Howard, Shon Hopwood, and Vida Johnson, each of whom will introduce themselves. And let's start with Marc.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. My name is Marc Howard. I'm a professor of government and law at Georgetown. I also direct the Prisons and Justice Initiative. And what we do, we're an academic center and host a lot of events, but we also run programs that are very deeply involved in criminal justice and prison reform. We have an exoneration program that reinvestigates wrongful convictions. We have several reentry programs, notably the Pivot program for formerly incarcerated people to become entrepreneurs. And most important for today's discussion, we run the Prison Scholars Program, where we offer courses, credit-bearing Georgetown courses at the DC jail and soon in a Maryland prison. And this is where COVID-19 has really affected our programming. It's something that we'll be talking about later. But I'm thrilled to be here. This is a topic that's very important. I've written several op-eds, one of which is coming out tomorrow in the New York Times. And I think the general public really needs to be aware of what's going on in prisons with COVID-19, because it's a disastrous situation.
Excellent. We're happy to have you, Marc. Shon.
Hi, my name's Shon Hopwood. I'm a professor at Georgetown Law. I work on issues related to the criminal justice system and prisoners, and both on the policy side and on the litigation side. Most recently, I have been working on compassionate release cases for people that are particularly vulnerable in federal prison, and also working on some of the lawsuits that have been filed against federal prisons by the ACLU and other people who are challenging the Federal Bureau of Prisons' response to the threat posed by COVID-19 in our nation's federal prisons. I'm also probably best known as someone who has been to prison themselves, because I spent over 10 years in federal prison for my role in some bank robberies when I was a young kid. This issue is very important to me. I have friends in the federal prison system. This is basically all I work on. And I am very concerned that our nation's government and our leaders are not responding appropriately, and people are going to needlessly die as a result.
Thank you, Shon. We look forward to hearing from you. And Vida.
Hi, my name is Vida Johnson, and I'm an associate professor of law. I teach in the 2 criminal defense clinics that Georgetown has, the Criminal Defense and Prisoner Advocacy Clinic and the Criminal Justice Clinic. I also am the co-director of the E. Barrett Prettyman program at Georgetown. Our students and fellows have worked on motions to reduce sentence for clients who are at the DC jail. And we're now also working on compassionate release motions for DC prisoners who serve their sentences at the Bureau of Prisons. I'm so happy to be discussing and shining a light on this really important issue.
All right. Thank you, Vida. So let's jump right in. I really think we should set the stage for this conversation by talking about why these numbers are so high. Why is COVID-19 spreading so rapidly in our jails and prisons? And so let me start with you, Marc, to help us paint the picture. What is it about the conditions of confinement that make these facilities so incredibly dangerous?
Well, in a nutshell, everything that is recommended to all of us on the outside in terms of social distancing, in terms of hygiene, sanitation, protection, is almost impossible on the inside. And so when you have prisons that are overcrowded the way American prisons are, to a degree that's unprecedented across the world and throughout history, you cannot separate people so that they're not in contact with each other. Plus, you have the fact that hand sanitizer is considered contraband inside because it contains alcohol. Other PPE products are unavailable, or only very recently, thanks to philanthropy, have actually become available. all of the measures that we would recommend that people take are not there. They're living in confined spaces, they're eating together, they're being moved around together. There are people coming in and out of prisons, volunteers, staff. So the exposure came in from the outside and then spread like wildfire on the inside. So it's really a tinderbox. And this was very predictable. I think there has been some action lately, but unfortunately, it's come much too late because COVID-19 is really rampant throughout most prisons and jails.
Absolutely, making it a complete hotspot in particular. And those same conditions exist there as well? You're on mute.
Yes, absolutely. We have some of the exact same problems. You have prisoners sharing cells in DC in some cases, though that has improved. There's a lack of adequate exercise and nutrition, which of course makes everyone less healthy. The DC jail is an old building with poor ventilation. There's a lack of access to cleaning supplies. And prisoners are forced to do their own cleaning. There was a lawsuit that exposed that, at least at the time of the lawsuit, that prisoners were reusing the same rags to clean. So just so many really important issues that need to be addressed.
Absolutely. And Shon, any differences in the federal facilities? Are the conditions of the confinement the same?
Well, yes, in some respects. I think, one of the other problems is that when someone does get infected with COVID-19 in any prison in America, our prison medical services are not very good in the best of times, and they are ill-equipped to be able to handle a large outbreak of people. And if you look at where our jails are, particularly our prisons are located, so many of them are located in small rural communities that when the staff gets infected, they won't be able to handle that either. And so, it's not just a concern with the people in prison. This is eventually going to get out and overwhelm these small communities where our prisons are located, and our health system is ill-equipped to be able to handle that sort of large-scale outbreak.
So Shon, that actually provides a wonderful segue for all of us. I mean, because I wanted to press this issue a little bit further. It's clear from what you all are saying and what many of us know that the physical conditions of confinement are accelerating the spread of COVID, but jails and prisons are particularly bad places to house offenders during a pandemic for a whole host of reasons. And you highlighted one, the fact that there's very poor medical care within the facilities. And if I think about the juvenile justice system, or reflect on the juvenile justice system, youth in facilities are supposed to be in there for rehabilitation. And COVID-19 has truly wreaked havoc on whatever rehabilitative, mental health, and vocational services were available to youth in those facilities. Their families can't visit, arts and recreation programs have been suspended, teachers, therapists, and religious volunteers are no longer able to enter those facilities. And youth who are suspected of having COVID are put into solitary confinement, further depriving them of whatever services and programming that would have been available to them. And so I would love for us to say a little bit more about how the pandemic has affected life on the inside of adult jails and prisons across the country. Vida, why don't we start with you, and then love to hear Marc, who you've done a lot of work inside as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I mean, you have so many people who are right now effectively serving time in solitary confinement. Prisoners have lost so many of the rehabilitative programs that existed inside of jails and prisons. They can't get visits from their family. They can't get legal visits. Their access to the telephone is curtailed. Same thing with, they don't have access to the internet. There's just a real lack of connection. I mean, we feel socially isolated. It just is an impossible situation for our fellow Americans inside of jails and prisons right now.
Yeah, Marc. Yeah.
Let me add, I think we're also frustrated. It's tempting to cast blame and say that this should be done differently. But the reality is it probably should have even happened sooner, the banning of visits, whether it's social, legal, or educational, programs that come in. As somebody who's involved in that program, it was very frustrating to me when it started because I wanted to go in, I wanted to continue our courses in person. But at the same time, we realized that it's really not safe, and arguably we'd be contributing to the spreading of this disease, this virus in prisons. And so what we've managed to do in our program specifically in Georgetown is actually, thanks to our partners at the Department of Corrections, who have been wonderful to work with on this issue, I have to say, which is that we've been able to have our scholars, as we call them, inside obtain tablets. So but we're able to finish our courses. We had 3 courses that were this spring semester, and our students were able to finish those courses on tablets and actually continue with tablet-based learning into the summer. I think it's very suboptimal. I think what people who are incarcerated really want and need is in-person contact, is people from the outside coming in and showing that they care, showing their concern, having the family be connected. But sadly, right now, that's not possible. I think there are some stopgap measures that we can implement, and I think that having more phone calls, although there are risks with that too, because if different people are passing the phone to each other, COVID could be spreading that way. There just aren't any easy solutions. Ultimately, I think it's a tragic situation that you have people who are essentially helpless, and we need, as a society on the outside, to really care about that and to feel the pain and to learn from it, so that this doesn't happen in the future, and hopefully so that some decarceral measures can be taken now.
And that's exactly right. We'll come back to that. We'll circle back to what are some of the responses, including the release. But I love that you mentioned this notion of tablets. One of the questions that we've gotten from one of our viewers is, are we providing, or is there a way for inmates to get access to online programming? And you've shown, Marc, that it's possible. What we need, obviously, is also commitment from those facilities. One, to allow for that kind of opportunity. Also for the allocation of resources at the state level and the county level. And then I also will make a note about the benefits of philanthropy at this moment, that we could really use donations to the programs that are available to work with inmates inside, both youth facilities and in adult facilities. So thank you very much for that.
And I just want to know, I think, the use of tablets is great, but not every prisoner at the DC jail has one.
Absolutely.
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
And these would be essential so that people could communicate with their lawyers. I mean, imagine the worry if you're pre-trial, presumed innocent, but court is closed. You have no idea when you are going to see a judge, when you can have the merits of your case argued, and you can't talk to your lawyer. I mean, this is a real crisis.
And one of the things that you'll often hear from people is, well, so what, we're taking visits, so what, we're taking these programs out, so what, we're putting people in solitary confinement because they committed the crime, they should do the time. That view is so short-sighted because 95% of people in our Americans' prisons are going to be released someday. And every study that's ever looked at the consequences of solitary confinement has said that it can cause long-lasting psychological damage. Why would we want to damage people further and then have them in that state when they're released? And so the entire public should be concerned about this, because it's not just limited to the people in prison. They're eventually one day going to return to the community, and we want them to return better off, not worse.
That's right. So Shon, thank you so much, because yet again, that's a great transition to where I think we should go next. Looking at this panel, I think it's fair to say, given your careers, that all of you share an empathy for the plight of prisoners. But we did want to make sure, as we constructed this panel, that we give voice to the fact that there are many, maybe even some of you who are listening, who are less empathetic to the plight of prisoners. Some will say, just as Shon said, that The inmates have to live with the consequences of their crime, and they knew that jails and prisons were dangerous places before they went in. Others will focus on victims' rights and the needs of those who've been injured by folks who are incarcerated. So I want us to say a little bit more. I mean, I think, Shon, you started us off well in understanding, well, we're all at risk, right? That if we don't handle, we don't address, and we don't provide for the safety of inmates, they're going to come out eventually and spread. But beyond that, what are some of the other reasons that, or how else might we respond to those who are less empathetic to prisoners? And I'll start with you, Vida. You're on mute, babe.
Yeah, thanks. You know, I think a lot of our viewers would be surprised to know that there are a lot of people who are held pre-trial in jails who, again, are presumed innocent, who are there simply because they are poor, that they cannot afford to post bail. If they had the money, they could get out and be at home on home confinement. And this is true. It's actually not true in DC, but in many parts of the country, this is absolutely the case. And again, there are people who are in jail because they've committed what I call subsistence crimes. We represented a gentleman in the clinic who stole oranges and soap from a chain grocery store and was sentenced to 30 days in jail just prior to this pandemic. And when we then went back to court and asked for his release, we met opposition from prosecutors who wanted him to serve his full 30 days in jail. So, you know, I think that if we just think about why some of these folks are in jail, that the amount of money spent incarcerating him, the cost to all of our health incarcerating someone for a short period of time, if you thought about that, I think people would understand that there are a lot of people in jail who just certainly should not be there. And then of course there are people in jail because of health issues like addiction or mental health issues, that if we invested in services, mental health services, substance abuse programs, we would be far better off than incarcerating them. And then there are a lot of people who are in prison who have aged out of crime. There's something called the age crime curve that basically after the age of 40, it's very unlikely that someone is going to reoffend. But because of our failed policies of the 80s and 90s, there's a significant number of people over the age of 50 in our prisons. It's something like 19% of federal prisoners are over the age of 51. I mean, it is just, these are folks that are not a danger who should be released. And of course, they are more likely to have poor health outcomes if they do contract COVID. And being in a jail and a prison is an easy way to contract COVID.
That's right. Marc, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I did. I agree with what Vida said. And I just want to suggest for people who may be skeptical, a recasting of how one thinks about them, meaning people who are incarcerated, versus us, people who are on the outside, because that dichotomy just breaks down. It's false to begin with, and I think we need to move from a demonization to a humanization lens. Studies have shown that almost half of Americans have a relative in their family who is or was incarcerated, but because of the stigma, they don't talk about it, they keep it hidden. And this is actually much closer to home than we realize. And what I think we need to think about, especially when hearing about these horrible stories about infection running rampant throughout prisons and jails, is that these might be our brothers and sisters, our cousins, our mothers and fathers, or children. And when you think of it that way, rather than thinking of the worst case scenario, the serial rapist, the axe murderer, the type of images that most people bring to mind and then want to use to justify really harsh and punitive measures, those are exceptions. Those are very rare. Let's think about people that we know and care about who made some mistakes that led them to be in this position, or as Vida said, who are still legally innocent or still awaiting trial, and there's so many of them in that position. But think about what you would want them to be subjected to. And I can guarantee you it's not what we're currently seeing today.
Thank you for that. It's a wonderful way to reframe the lens and to get us all thinking. And I will add 2 points. One on the age point that Vida made, and then on your humanizing point is to think about the number of children that are who are incarcerated at this moment, and helping folks remember and understand that much of adolescent behavior, criminal behavior, even serious offenses arises out of normal features of adolescent development. Children are impulsive. They follow their peers. They act without thinking ahead to the consequences. And so what we see is that many, even serious offenses are reflective of adolescence and not an indication that a young person is a violent threat to the community. So that's yet another way of thinking about the folks who are behind bars. So we're getting a lot of questions about, so what are the responses? What's been happening in jails and prisons in response to the outbreak? We know that some federal and state authorities have been extremely reluctant to make any changes or accommodations for inmates in response to the pandemic. For example, we recently learned that the Justice Department tried to resist a federal order requiring a low security prison in Ohio to transfer some of its most vulnerable patients to safer conditions and home confinement after 9 people died and hundreds were affected. That challenge by the Justice Department made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, and on Tuesday, the Supreme Court upheld that order. We also learned yesterday that Santa Barbara County got permission from the state of California to exclude prisoner cases from its total COVID-19 count so that it could meet the state's guidelines for reopening. And it's clear from that example that some counties want to reopen without adequately addressing the outbreak in prisons. So let's talk a bit about how different leaders in different jurisdictions are handling the challenge. So, let's start with Shon with the Bureau of Prisons. Can you talk a little bit about what's working and what's not? And then we'll talk to Vida and Marc.
Well, what's working in the federal prison system is not much. They have said that the Department of Justice and the BOP have said that they were going to place large numbers of people on home confinement in order to reduce the populations of prisons so that people could social distance and other measures that would be easier to implement. That has not really happened. They've released a few thousand people. If you look at the lawsuit against FCI Oakdale prison in Louisiana, the ACLU sued, and the judge ordered the government to respond about what they were doing. And they said, well, we're looking at potentially 70 people being eligible for release to home confinement out of a prison of 1,800. Sending the lowest security 70 people out is not going to improve the conditions in that prison. The one good thing that I have seen is that federal judges, many of them, have stepped up and have realized that when they sentence people to a particular sentence in federal prison, that should not be retroactively converted to a death sentence simply because the Bureau of Prisons can't keep those people safe. And so what we're seeing are judges across the country use compassionate release after it had been amended by Congress in the First Step Act to not just send people to home confinement to serve their sentence, but actually reducing their sentence to time served and getting the most vulnerable people out of prison altogether. And that's been a good development. I think judges have realized that, when I sentence someone to 3 years, I didn't sentence them to 3 years and death. Hopefully that will allow people to reevaluate their sentencing practices in normal times, because it's not like, even when we don't have the threat of COVID, that sending people to prison doesn't present a risk of harm. It presents a substantial risk of harm in many prisons. And my hope is that judges will take that into consideration from here on out.
That's excellent. And we'll talk about some long-term reforms after in a bit. But Vida, can you talk to us a little bit about what's happening in DC, what has been working and not working in DC?
Yeah, so I would say that the jail has made some strides. So based on a pleading that they filed recently in response to a lawsuit, it appears that their use of single cells, so putting one person in a cell as opposed to two, has gone up dramatically, with now 72% of folks in single cells. Now, this was only possible because the jail population declined by 27%, almost 30%, which I think is the current average jail population rate of declination since COVID-19. But the jail population declined because of advocacy, because of some legislation. The DC Council passed a law that changed the way good time is calculated. So people serving misdemeanor sentences are getting out earlier than they used to. There's now a compassionate release statute that was passed as well. And so I don't know whether anyone has been released from the DC jail based on the compassionate release statute, but I think that we should be seeing some of that. The jail says it's changed the way folks serving or folks there can put in sick call slips. It used to be that you could only make a request for medical attention during your rec time. And so if you were too sick to go out for rec, you couldn't get the slip, and you can't make the request until you have the slip. And so they say that now they send medical staff to each unit every day to see if anyone needs any help. So those are really positive changes. I will say those changes came from litigation, from what I can tell. And so that hopefully will be inspiring to the law students on this call.
Great. And Marc, did you want to add to, what's working and what's not?
Yeah, well, let me just make a quick point. In DC, we've actually had in our program some of our students inside who've been released with compassionate release. And I think that's been very beneficial. Some of them on monitored home confinement, others with shortened sentences. And when that's happened, it's been wonderful. They've actually joined my classes through Zoom on the outside. They've been great participants. And I think that's something that, to me, sets an example that others should emulate. In terms of the national responses, it's really been all over the map, but there have been a number of jurisdictions where they have made a conscious effort, particularly in jails, particularly pre-trial, but even across the board, and some judges have supported this, to release many people who would be deemed not threatening and not a threat to public safety. And the results have been, I think, very positive. There hasn't been a rise in crime. There haven't been some of the worst case scenarios that fear mongers, and they're always there, and they always want to spread this image that crime is going to run rampant if you let people out of prison, but that hasn't happened. Then there's this case of Chicago that someone will quickly want to cite, I bet, where there was a lot of violence over Memorial Day weekend. Well, if you scratch the surface, you realize, one, it was a very hot weekend. There's often a tradition of violence over that weekend. And the other thing is that after it happened, you had the mayor being very upset at the police chief saying, what the hell happened? And then the police chief saying, well, we let people early out of prison, that's why. That to me sounds like behind covering, not rational logic. There's no empirical evidence to support that. And there's a lot of evidence to say that crime has not gone up. And I think that really makes us rethink overall. And I do think there's a positive that could come out of this, which is a decarceration that's much needed, which is that there are many people who should no longer be in prison, who represent no public safety threat. So if you have a retributive view and you think they should just be punished because they did something bad, no matter how long ago it was, that's one thing. But if what you really care about is public safety, and I certainly do, then you need to look at who is dangerous. And what you'll find is that there are many people who are not, for reasons we talked about earlier, whether it's aging out, whether it's the fact that they were really young at the time, nature of the particular offense, circumstances behind it. These don't come up in sort of the scary headlines or bullet points of the fear mongers, but they're very real. And I think there's an opportunity here to push for decarceration, to achieve some of it, even if it's temporary, and then to show that it actually works.
Excellent.
And let me just join in on Marc's excellent points. I mean, another really great thing that's been happening in DC is that rather than arrest people who the police suspect of having committed a crime, police have now been issuing citations. And so rather than having them held overnight and having to go to court and then increase the chances that they're held, folks are being given citations to come to court and report after the pandemic has settled. And so that has also reduced the number of people going into the DC jail, the fact that those folks haven't been presented. And if you think about it, if those folks aren't being arrested and they're okay, maybe they don't need to go through the criminal legal system at all.
Absolutely. And I definitely want us to circle back and talk about long-term reforms in a post-COVID world. But before we do that, I really want to sit for a minute on this public safety question, right? And so thank you, Marc, for bringing up the Chicago example. Let's tease out this question of release, right? And so I'm getting a number of questions in the Q&A, and we amongst ourselves have been talking about that. Some states and counties have responded to the pandemic, we know, by releasing inmates. And I think the most recent data shows that the typical jail has reduced its population by about 30% as a result of the pandemic. And most of those releases have been among nonviolent offenders. But how do we know which prisoners should be released and who gets to make this decision? Circling back to something that Shon said earlier, Attorney General Bill Barr announced that federal prisons would be releasing the most vulnerable and nonviolent inmates to home confinement. But at the same time, the Justice Department was working behind the scenes to make it harder for someone to actually qualify as low risk, right? And so how do we know who should get released? And is there a fair and appropriate distinction between violent and nonviolent offenders? And so let me start with Marc on that one to tease that out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a convenient fiction that I think many people, frankly, on the left and the right, have been pushing, that there's this sort of category of nonviolent drug offenders and they're wonderful, and that they're the vast majority of people in prison, that we can let them out and have no problems. And then there's this other category we won't talk about, that's so-called violent offender. That dichotomy is meaningless. The definition of violent and nonviolent is so varied. It's not certainly what we think of intuitively. But then there's the bigger question of what does it actually mean in terms of who the person is at the point we're taking them today. Many people who committed so-called violent crimes, who served a lot of time in prison, much more than they would have in other countries, represent an almost insignificant, almost zero public safety risk when they've aged out, when they've served a lot of time, when they're ready to return and never come back to prison. And actually, you know, to flip it the other way, is that many people who are so-called nonviolent, people who are struggling with addiction problems and so on, who probably deserve treatment rather than prison in the first place, but they're much more likely actually to recidivate, to slip up. And so we really need to, I think, break down this dichotomy. I understand how it's convenient. I understand how the Obama administration pushed for it. It was kind of the low-hanging fruit that society could accept, but we need to go much deeper. And, you know, maybe this is a good way to hand it off to Shon to respond, because, you know, I look at him as my close friend who knows my family and I know his, and society could label him a violent offender. He doesn't look like a violent offender to me. Not that one could ever really tell what that means, but the point is people change. And Shon's a living example of it, and someone who's really dedicating his life to helping others realize that too.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why if you ever come to a speaking event of mine, whether it's the Rotary Club, the White House, a law school, what have you, I always usually start off with this introduction. My name's Shon Hopwood. I'm an associate professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, and I committed a violent crime, but I am not a violent criminal. And I start my talk with that to just get people in the mindset that, you know, crime is not a character trait, and even if it were, character is not static and people change, and everyone goes through mass change between, you know, the era in which most crimes are committed, where someone's 18 to 25, and then you move forward to 35 and 40, people go through profound change. So if we know that, if we know all the science tells us that, why do we think people in prison can't change? And if the answer is because they're in prison, well, maybe that says something about the system and not necessarily them as individuals. You know, we tend to view people as, once they've committed a crime, that this is, you know, they're destined to be recidivists, but that the statistics just do not bear that out. In fact, the statistics tell us that people, as Vida noted, age out of crime, and that there is really no reason even to keep people who have committed violent offenses in prison for as long as we do. And again, hopefully, COVID-19 and the threat posed to people in prison should reflect on kind of our large-scale practices of why we keep people as long as we do. And, there are various reasons why we do that. Some people, it's all about punishment, but some, and I think Bill Barr is one of them, is he believes that if we release anyone early, it will lead to less deterrence, that there is certainty in sentencing, and that matters to keep people deterred from crimes. There's no data that says that is true. In fact, most people, and I talk to roomfuls of lawyers, don't know what's a crime, and they certainly don't know what the punishment is. So how could they be deterred about something they didn't even know about? But these are some of the reasons why our public officials have difficulty releasing people even in a pandemic.
Right. And so, Shon, it's so great.
I'm going to add one small thing too. Any of the rehabilitative goals of prison sentences, none of those are being met right now, because basically all programming has ceased in prisons. There's no educational classes going on. There's no substance abuse treatment, little to no mental health treatment. So, everything Shon and Marc is saying is right. And there's just literally no reason to continue to house people for long periods of time in the middle of the pandemic.
Absolutely. Let me say this. Everything that Shon has just said applies with equal force to Black and Brown people who are in the system. So this is a wonderful place to talk about the ways in which race, class, status, access to power affect our understandings and our perceptions of who's dangerous and who's not on these very sort of artificial lines of violent and nonviolent. And some of the complaints about the risk assessment tool that has been used by the Federal Bureau of Prisons has centered around this very question, or this very issue, that the tools exacerbate racial bias, right? Let's look at, in that vein, the considerable publicity that we have seen around the high-profile releases of folks like Paul Manafort, Michael Cohen, Michael Avenatti, while at the same time, 98% of federal inmates remain in. And so can you say a word, let me start with you, Shon, about how these high-profile releases, or what these high-profile releases say about race, class, status, and power?
Yeah, they say that the laws and even our sentence aren't applied equally to people. There's no doubt that that tool that the Department of Justice uses will lead to racial disparities, in part because it inputs criminal history and some other things that there's already a racial disproportionate impact. And so that just gets embedded within the tool. And some of it too is in the federal system is the nature of the offense. The Bureau of Prisons has always viewed white collar offenders as less risky than anyone else. White collar offenders are mostly white. And if you look at some of the data, a lot of white collar offenders who are white, who are serial fraudsters, are the ones that are the most dangerous to release and get back out into the system, because they will not stop defrauding people. But that doesn't really come through with the releases we're seeing. We're seeing, certain classes of people being released, and, I have a bunch of clients who are no danger to anyone and who are particularly vulnerable and who are over the age of 60, and they can't even get real review about whether they should be sent to home confinement.
Yeah. Do Marc or Vida want to add to that? Marc.
Sure, go ahead, Vida. I'll go after.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, it also says quite a bit about access to quality representation.
Yeah, which
Sorry.
we've gotten actually a number of questions on that. So I'm going to come back to that. But Marc, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely critical to bring up the racial disparities, because we see them at every single level of the criminal justice system. You can't have a conversation about criminal justice without bringing up race and the racial disparities. So whether it's in, policing and arrests, then to prosecution, and to what happens at trial, and then to sentences, and even frankly, in terms of prison conditions and who gets sent to solitary confinement at every single stage. Also in the parole process, sort of the regular release process, there are vast racial disparities, always to the detriment of people of color. But now we're even seeing it on the compassionate release side through these sort of pseudoscientific models that have allowed several people, high profile people, to be released. Now, I want to say I'm not opposing the release of Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen. My point is we should extend the same compassion, the same logic to a much wider segment of the population. And it's really troubling to me that it's been limited in this way, but we really need to be expanding this and looking at release much more broadly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I always like, can I add one point?
Sure.
I always like to say when people look at a release or a small sentence for someone who is privileged, we should all want to level down and not level up.
Right.
We want to bring the sentences of people that aren't privileged down to the same sentence level of people that are, and not level up and just punish everybody uniformly.
Right. So let's talk about the ways in which access to counsel is impacting these outcomes, around race, class, and the like. We've gotten a number of questions in the feed about access to counsel. Maybe Vida, you can talk a little bit about that, and actually Shon too, but our attorneys, our inmates getting access to their lawyers. You talked about that a little bit at the beginning, but what accommodations are being made? Again, what's working, what's not?
Well, I'll say, this allows me to shine a light on some of the work that our students and fellows have done. We were able to get a list of all of the people serving misdemeanor sentences who were at the DC jail. Through some litigation that the Public Defender Service had done. And through that, we were able to see that there were so many people who were serving short misdemeanor sentences, who were going to come out in 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, whose lawyers just hadn't been able to file motions on their behalf. And so in many cases, we were able to get the lawyer's permission and the client's permission and file motions, and they were released. We were able, with the help of many people on the Criminal Justice Act panel as well, the misdemeanor population of the jail went from over 100 to, I think, some small number. It just completely shrunk. But this, again, it just, people should have access to lawyers who are able to fight for them. And this isn't something that we're seeing across the board, and it's a shame.
So some of the other questions, and I'll come to you, Shon, in addition to that are, issues of confidentiality. How is the communication happening in facilities? So maybe, Shon, you could go there.
Yeah, it's in best of times, it's not good for me to get a hold of my clients. I have to call the federal prison, hope that somebody answers, hope I can get transferred to the case manager, hope I can get a call set up at a time that's convenient. And then, sometimes my client goes to sit down in their counselor's office, and the counselor says, well, I'm just going to sit in because I'm not going to hear what your lawyer's saying, not realizing that we lose the privilege that way. And that, it's just as privileged what my client's saying back to me as what I'm saying to the client. So it has been awful to try and get a hold of clients for compassionate release cases. As to larger access, some groups are stepping up. FAM, a group that I'm on the board of, has teamed with the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers to run a compassionate release clearinghouse. They have paired over 500 of the most vulnerable people in prison with top-notch lawyers from Washington, D.C. and other places. So people are stepping up, but we just need more people to be involved, and we need to streamline things like attorney-client communications, and also some of the rules for getting admitted pro hoc vice in federal courts. It's very hard for lawyers to take a case from Georgia because sometimes they can't get admitted there, even if they're trying to take this case pro bono. And lawyers have just run into a whole bunch of stumbling blocks and hurdles that are thrown up by the system for whatever reason. And those rules don't match up with the crisis we have during this pandemic.
Yeah, so it's an excellent sort of roadmap for some of the reforms that are needed. And you referenced FAM. Do you want to tell us what FAM is? Is that
Families? Yeah, it's Families Against Mandatory Minimums. It was a group started by a woman named Julie Stewart in the early 90s, whose brother went to prison for a mandatory minimum sentence for a marijuana offense. And it's now, you know, one of the national criminal justice reform groups. And I'd say I work with them all the time, and FAM is family to me. And they are the one thing I'll say that separates them from almost every other criminal justice reform organization is they're in daily contact with 40,000 people in federal prison and their families. And that's, I think, their greatest strength.
And what I think is so important about all of the sort of the organizations that we've talked about is that for those of you who are listening and wanting to know what you can do, it's how do you engage with some of the justice reform organizations? How do you lobby your, state legislators? What philanthropic donations might you make? All of these are really important. So we only have about 8 minutes, and I want us to end with a question that we've gotten in the feed, and that one that we've been thinking about, which is, look, will there be some lasting reforms? Or does this pandemic create an opportunity for us to think about and to try out some lasting reforms in the juvenile and criminal justice systems? So the question that I want to pose to all of you is, look, what should our criminal justice system look like, and what should our prisons and jails look like after the pandemic? So I'll start with Marc.
Sure. I think I alluded to my answer a little bit earlier, that it has to do with humanization. And I do think that this is an opportunity, that there's some positives that might come out of these tragedies. Just the fact that there have been major stories, about the woman, Andrea Baer, who gave birth on a ventilator and died, and their baby lived, and the baby's going to grow up without a mother. And she's, serving 2 years for an offense distributing meth that she never should have been in for, that even many in her case had actually recommended that she'd be going to drug treatment. And these stories, there's others of a man who had served 44 years in prison since he was 16 years old, and he was 2 weeks from his parole date and died of COVID-19. There's other people who were wrongfully convicted, and it's an issue that I deal with as well, who had hearings, who had real opportunities to actually come home from prison, and now we're stuck in this sort of purgatory of waiting, of everything being delayed. These stories are humanizing. These stories make outsiders care, I think, in a way that they didn't before. So the pandemic has kind of heightened our sensibilities and made us think about personal health and well-being. And I think there's an opportunity there to follow through on that and to realize that, again, as I said earlier, they are us, that we're one and the same, and that we need to care about them in the same way. And I will mention, since you talked about organizations, that I've recently founded a nonprofit organization called the Frederick Project for Justice, that really seeks to bring in outsiders to care about people who are incarcerated, and ultimately, when the pandemic is cleared, to be bringing people in on visits in prisons around the country. And this is something that I think is really critical for the proximity, because there's nothing like actually sitting face to face with someone who's incarcerated and realizing that they're just like you, or just like your brother or cousin. And humanization is ultimately what it's about. And I think there's an opportunity in this crisis and tragedy.
Excellent. Vida.
And I'll just add, we touched on this briefly before, but we should shrink this system. There are people who get arrested every day who don't need to be arrested. We could focus our resources better on housing people, on getting health care to people, mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment. If we focus on those things, we would have a smaller carceral system, and that's what we should all be aiming for. We've seen how deadly and dangerous housing people together this callously and this inhumanely, we've seen what it's done, and it's not pretty.
So let me just add to that before I go to Shon. This language of decarceration is really important. And one of our viewers submitted a question that I thought was very painful and powerful at the same time, which is that there are foster children who are being held in juvenile detention facilities. And that when we talk about, decarceration, we tend to limit that thinking to folks who are, who have been convicted of crimes, but that we need to expand that conversation to include folks who are in facilities, via the abuse and neglect system, people who are in facilities because of mental health conditions and the like. And so
non-citizens as well.
And say it again.
Non-citizens.
And non-citizens, right. So it's a much broader conversation to have. Shon, what is your post-COVID criminal justice system and prison system look like?
Well, I think Marc's point about humanizing people in prison is really important. But I tell you, the thing I've been thinking most about is I want legal change coming on the back end of this pandemic. I want Congress to think about reducing sentence lengths across the board. I want them to think about more options for release, both if another pandemic would hit and just second opportunities for early release for people who have shown, they're no longer a danger to anyone if released and they've been rehabilitated. I'd like to see sentencing judges think more about, they're sentencing people to significant risks of harm every day that they send people to prison, because our American prisons are incredibly dangerous and have horrible conditions. I want judges to hold the Bureau of Prisons and the Department of Justice accountable for their lack of response for COVID. The Eighth Amendment says if you subject someone in prison to a substantial risk of harm that you know about and then you respond unreasonably, that is cruel and unusual punishment. And that's what I'm seeing across the board. And I hope that, lawyers will step up and bring lawsuits on for families like, the woman that died and a man who's 70 years old serving time for a nonviolent drug offense and had several medical conditions that made him vulnerable, and the Bureau of Prisons didn't get that person out and they died. I want those lawsuits brought, and I want people held accountable, because that is the way to get the legal change to happen.
Yeah, beautiful. So I actually thought I was going to end there, but I have to add another question, because I've noticed that in our feed, there are a number of formerly incarcerated folks who are participating in the Q&A, and a number of folks who have, there you go, Shon, a number of folks who have relatives, family members who are incarcerated. And so I think the last couple of questions should be twofold. One is, one question that we got was, how do I help advocate, if I'm someone who's formerly incarcerated, how do I advocate for those who, quote unquote, I left behind? That's one question. And then the other question that we got was around women. We haven't talked about women in prison specifically. And there's a wonderful question about, has the pandemic affected women differently in prisons? Marc, you did give the example of the woman who gave birth in prison, but beyond that. So those are the two questions. Shon, do you want to take the one about, so what advice do you have for folks who've been recently released and want to help those left behind?
I think, staying in contact with people who they've left behind is very important. One of the things that prison does to you is it isolates you from everyone that you care about and that you love. And, the science tells us that more people have phone calls and letters and visitations with people they care about. They tend to do better both in prison and better when they get out. Community is so important because we're social beings and we require that in order to thrive. So that's one way. I think the second way is, join up with criminal justice organizations that are already doing this work. They have the expertise on how to advocate, and they're always, groups like FAM are always looking for people who have gotten out of the system and using them and their story to show, listen, American public, the people that you think are in prison are just like you. They look just like you. Some of them act just like you, and they will be fine if they're released early. And let those criminal justice reform groups tell your story and use that in advocacy. So that would be two things.
That's excellent. Very good pieces of advice. And what about women? Are we seeing, the pandemic have a unique impact on women and girls in the system?
Some law professors and some lawyers, and with help from the ACLU and others, have already brought a suit against FCI Danbury up in Connecticut, which is the major women's federal prison. And, you know, yes, this definitely impacts women differently, just like it impacts people of color differently, just like it impacts elderly people differently. And there are some things that are unique to the prison system that harm women. And, you know, we're hopeful that the judge that's considering this case will take that into consideration and get some people out of Danbury.
Excellent, excellent. Marc?
Yeah, we actually have two of our former students from the DC jail who were then, when they were sentenced, were sent to FCI Danbury, and I'm in touch with both of them through Core Links, the federal prison email system. And it's a horror show, what's been taking place. And there's been this bait and switch with this lure of compassionate release and people being told they're on a list, and then on the day when some people are going home, they're suddenly not released. It's been something that's really been horrifying for me to see, particularly with the two people that I'm in touch with there that I care about deeply. But the larger issue is real. I haven't seen widespread evidence just about the impact of COVID-19 on women in particular. Women are 7% of the US prison population, which might sound small, but when you think of it comparatively, it's 10 times higher than any comparable country in terms of the level of incarceration of women, and it's the fastest growing group within prisons. But there is some evidence in terms of solitary confinement being particularly damaging for women in general terms, and that now that we know that this is sort of the kind of treatment for COVID-19, we can, you know, I think guess that there are going to be some damaging mental health effects on women in particular there.
Thank you, Marc. And thank all of you, Vida, Shon, Marc, for, I think, an important conversation that we could continue literally all day long. There's so much to do, there's so much to learn. And there's so many ways that I think our listeners can help. So I hope this conversation has been a point of inspiration, you know, somewhat depressing facts, but some, you know, points of activism that you can take and you can engage in. So we thank you so much for joining us. And for those who joined late or want to share this with others, please let them know that it will be posted and available on our social media feeds through Georgetown Law, our Facebook page, Twitter, and our YouTube channels eventually. All right. So thank you very much. Have a good day.